This isn't just a story of revenge. This is a story of how revenge hurts both parties. To this day, a solid revenge tale still gives me this warm, fuzzy feeling deep inside. I think it all stems from this wild college experience years back when I got back at my cheating girlfriend, and let me tell you, it felt incredible. I know it's wrong to revel in it, but I can't ignore the sheer satisfaction it brought me. It's probably one of my top favorite feelings. Though I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, I'm going to do my best not to portray my ex, let's call her Haley, as the absolute villain, and myself as some innocent bystander. I want to recount this as truthfully as possible, even if it doesn't cost me in the best light bit of context and backstory. During this time, I was playing Division I NCAA basketball at a university, which meant I was constantly on the road traveling to different cities and states every week. My entire life was wrapped up in the game. In the midst of this story, I was in the early throes of a nasty drug and alcohol habit. Years later, I managed to get clean and joined a program you can easily find listed in any phone book. I'm sure many of you reading this are also in recovery and understand the struggles we addicts and alcoholics face. This story is my way of explaining a flaw in my character that emerged from these events, leading me down a very dark path. However, I don't intend for this story to come off as a plea for sympathy. Lastly, I always considered myself a good kid, never really troubled. My upbringing was tough, but I managed to keep a general kindness towards others and almost always did the right thing or took the high road. When it came to dating, I knew people cheated in relationships, but at the time of this story, I figured that was something other people dealt with, not me. I always assumed that because I was a 5-star boyfriend and made great choices in women, infidelity wouldn't touch my relationships. I was naive. I thought pretty highly of myself and had that typical early 20s arrogance, I suppose, the buildup. It was my junior year at university, and I'd been single for about a year after my high school girlfriend and I called it quits. After 3 years, I chalked that relationship up as a learning experience and felt I knew what to look for in my next girlfriend. I believed the next woman I chose to date would likely be the one I'd marry and start my future with. I know, young and dumb thinking. I knew it all. I had my eye on this girl at school. Let's call her Natalie. I noticed Natalie around the collegiate athletic facility where all the university teams trained and had their locker rooms. She was a star on the track team and really talented. The various athletic teams often threw parties, and I knew that the first one I saw her at ID introduce myself and try to chat her up, see where it might lead. Soon enough, I spotted Natalie at one of these parties. We passed each other on the stairs, made eye contact, and she smiled at me. I struck up a conversation, and after a bit of back and forth, we exchanged numbers. We then embarked on the classic American flirtation dance, where we hinted at our interest in each other without coming right out and saying it. For weeks, we sent texts back and forth subtly indicating our mutual attraction while trying to play it cool. At the time, Natalie was on a break with her current boyfriend, a popular football player. She eventually left him entirely to date me. This should have been a glaring red flag, but my arrogance was blinding. Her leaving him for me only inflated my ego. I was excelling in my sport, and if she was willing to ditch this guy for me, then surely she'd never leave me for anyone else, Lamau. I was such a damn fool, I can't begin to describe how into Natalie I was. I was addictively attracted to her, always pinching myself at the thought that my crush was actually into me too. I was so wrapped up and blinded by my infatuation that I ignored countless red flags. Our relationship was progressing at lightning speed, and because of this, I never took the time to really evaluate why I liked her so much. Fast forward about 8 months, we were officially together. Natalie had her own athlete's dorm room, but I was a couple of years older than her and working full-time during the summers. And part-time during the school year, I had my own apartment near campus, and Natalie was basically living with me. She even stayed there when I was out of town, which was about 3 or 4 days a week, because of the season and all the traveling with the team. Despite all this, Natalie and I were deeply in love. At the end of the season, I planned 2 huge back-to-back parties. One was for my teammate's birthday on Friday night, and the other was for my birthday on Saturday night. They happened to fall on consecutive days, luckily landing on a Friday and Saturday night. That Natalie kept a period tracking app on her phone. She was asleep, and in my drunken state, I remembered she always marked down when we had unprotected sex, so she could keep track if she missed her period. Being an athlete, she often missed her periods. My inebriated brain thought it was a good idea to have her update the app right then, as we'd likely forget by morning given how messed up we were. So I woke her up and mumbled, Can you put in that calendar that we had unprotected sex? It was around 5 a.m., and we were that special kind of 5 a.m. drunk, where exhaustion takes over. She unlocked her phone, opened the app, and promptly fell back asleep before she could do anything. So I took her phone while it was still unlocked and tried to figure out how to input the information myself. Side note: throughout our entire relationship, Natalie constantly went through my computer and phone. She was very insecure and always suspicious. I never minded because I had nothing to hide. I never did anything shady. Looking back, this was another glaring red flag I ignored. I truly believed this girl would never cheat on me. So this wasn't one of those stories where I went snooping through her phone with a hunch and found something incriminating. In this case, I was simply trying to navigate her period calendar while drunk with no suspicions in my mind. Friday. Natalie and I got drunk and ended up having unprotected sex. When I looked at the period tracking app on Natalie's phone, I saw all kinds of little markers on different days of each month. Each marker was a different color, so I opened one to see what the color coding meant. Red obviously symbolizes her period, and then there were black markers showing when she had unprotected sex. This is when my heart sank into my stomach. This damn calendar was littered with black markers. It looked like a checkerboard with only a handful of red pieces left, and black markers everywhere. There were black markers on dates. When I was in a different city playing basketball, I proceeded to open all the black markers going back through our entire relationship. We didn't have unprotected sex very often, maybe once or twice a month. She had written the names of the guys she had unprotected sex with in the notes section of the black markers. There were a total of 4 guys throughout our relationship that she allowed to penetrate her raw. Some months had almost a dozen of those black markers. Sometimes there were 2 in one day. Looking back, I wonder if there were more men not listed because she only kept track of the time she had unprotected sex. In almost every infidelity story I hear, the discovery involves text messages, a friend informing you, or catching your partner red-handed by coming home early. I, on the other hand, stumbled upon a well-documented ledger of almost every time she cheated and had unprotected sex. Among the 4 guys I discovered, one was her ex, the very guy she had originally left to date me. Cheating on me with him was a frequent occurrence. Then there was another unknown guy she was clearly seeing regularly. The last 2 seemed to be one-time flings, but again these markers only recorded the times she had unprotected sex. Who knows what the full story was? I sobered up real quick. I then proceeded to go through Natalie's texts and calls but found nothing. However, at the time, Android phones had a folder where you could see deleted texts, though not the contents of the messages. She had thousands of deleted texts and calls. I couldn't read them, but I saw the numbers and did a quick Facebook search. I matched one with her ex and found something like half a dozen other random guys. The worst part was finding 2 of my teammates, one of whom I was actually pretty close with. After a few minutes, I just put the phone down. The evidence was overwhelming. The more I looked at it, the more my insides churned. I felt so defeated. I can't fully describe the feeling, but I'm sure anyone reading this who has caught a significant other cheating knows exactly what I mean. I felt like a complete idiot for trusting her and having no suspicions. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times I had the chance to cheat, but chose to stay faithful to Natalie. I felt like an idiot for not taking those opportunities. My loyalty now seemed like a waste. I know it sounds ridiculous and irrelevant in light of her infidelity, but I kept obsessing over it. If I had cheated too, maybe I wouldn't have felt so much pain in that moment. All I could focus on was how deeply I was hurt. I would have done anything to escape the pain and embarrassment. Question: am I the only one who felt this way after catching their partner cheating? I'm genuinely curious if others have had similar thoughts. I left my apartment and went for a long walk. I had never experienced such intense emotions and had no idea how to process them. It felt like my ego was being dismantled right in front of me. I didn't know what to do and was too embarrassed to tell anyone. My sadness quickly turned to anger. I knew I was going to get my revenge. I just didn't know how. Yet I was seething with rage and wanted to ensure she never recovered from this. My roommate, teammate, and best friend at the time, who was sleeping on the couch in my living room, we'll call him Victor, was an Eastern European kid who stood 7 feet tall and had a demeanor as Russian as you can imagine. He also had a ridiculously unique real name, hence Victor. Well, Victor called me shortly after I started my walk. I answered, and he asked where I was. I asked him to keep this between us and told him what happened. He stayed on the phone and went into my room, and I heard him yell in his Russian accent, "Yo, bitch, you cheated on OP." I faintly heard Natalie say something in the background, and then Victor yelled at her to get out of the apartment. After some scuffling, Victor got back on the line and said, "Yo, she's gone. Come back and let's talk." I headed back home, and Victor and I went over what had happened. Things didn't get sappy because we were both alpha males from cultures where men don't cry, and neither of us knew what to say or do in this situation. Victor made his best attempt to comfort me and said, "Tonight is your birthday. We're going to get messed up and find you some girls. Forget her. I never liked her anyway." Oh yeah, that day was my birthday. Forgot about that part. Victor and I went out for breakfast. I was still a little drunk. My phone was blowing up with calls and texts from Natalie. I told her I saw everything on her phone and couldn't stand to speak with or look at her. She kept trying to convince me to let her come to my birthday party, but I made it clear I didn't want her there. She was obviously worried about exactly what Victor had suggested earlier when we chatted. Natalie's entire social standing revolved around being with me. I had a feeling most people didn't really like her, but tolerated her because we were a couple. She knew that if I acted single at my birthday party and she wasn't there, everyone would realize something was wrong. I think her main concern was avoiding embarrassment, not saving our relationship. The night of my birthday is mostly a blur. A friend from California had sent me a birthday package loaded with some premium weed, hash moon rocks pills, and the devil's dandruff, and I plunged headfirst into an intoxicating escape. One clear memory I have is sitting in a chair during the pregame for my party. There were two girls perched on the arms of the chair, and someone snapped a photo of that moment. We were getting ready to head out, and I had reserved a few tables at a popular downtown nightclub. The combination of booze and drugs was the only thing making me feel normal. In the photo, I had my sunglasses on and a wide, happy grin plastered on my face, but if you look closely, you can see the pain I was hiding behind that smile. As I sat in that chair, the drugs began to take full effect. This was the first time I used substances not to party, but to numb the pain and make myself feel normal. It was a desperate attempt to drown out the hurt and humiliation I felt inside. I remember thinking, I want to feel like this forever. I never want to experience that kind of pain again. With drugs, I have control, and no one can hurt me anymore. Oh, how ironic that turned out to be in the years that followed. When my teammates and friends asked why Natalie wasn't at the party, I told them we were done, but I kept the details to myself. I didn't let on that I was affected by it. In any way, I just played it cool and focused everyone on the party. The revenge. So this is one of those revenge tales where the plan was half-baked. I knew I wanted to get back at Natalie for the immense pain she caused me, but I mostly improvised as opportunities presented themselves. My one-kind spirit died that night on the party chair. All my morals went out the window. I'd never cheated in relationships before, so I thought I'd never be cheated on. Looking back, I realize how naive that was, but that was my mindset at the time. I didn't care about the collateral damage as long as I succeeded in hurting Natalie as much as possible. So I adopted a new selfish mindset and continued with it every day. Later that week, while skimming through Facebook on my computer, I came across the profile of one of her track teammates. That's when my first vengeful idea hit me. I decided to target her teammates and see if I could lure them in. Although I had no proof she'd hooked up with my teammates, it was clear she was trying to hide conversations with them. So I figured I'd see how many of her close acquaintances I could passionately embrace. Fortunately, I had more options than she did when cheating on me. A women's track team is much larger than a men's basketball team. And let's be honest, they're also a lot better looking. The teammate of Natalie's that I first spotted on Facebook had a boyfriend, but I thought, clearly everyone cheats. Let's see if it's true. I started the usual social media flirtation, liking a few of her photos, and she reciprocated. I sent her a message, and within a week she was in my bed. I followed a similar pattern with other members of her relay team. 2 out of the 3 girls I passionately embraced were in relationships, and cheating on their boyfriends with me stirred up some mixed emotions. On one hand, it inflated my wounded ego. On the other, it made me bitter and sad, fueling a women ain't shit, none of them are loyal attitude. This became my go-to strategy because in my messed up mindset, it served 2 purposes. First, it exposed cheaters, but more importantly, if they were willing to cheat on their boyfriends, they would A. be more secretive about it, which would amplify the drama when it eventually came out, and B, it made me feel better about Natalie's betrayal, proving to myself that it wasn't me who was the problem. It was women in general. I know it's messed up, but that's how I thought back then. I started collecting mementos from every girl I hooked up with, bras, panties, jewelry, and so on. Not for any creepy reason, but it was part of my plan. Sometimes I didn't even have to make an effort. For example, one girl left behind a pair of very distinctive shoes. I knew Natalie would recognize them. They belonged to the girl who had rebounded with Natalie's ex after their breakup situation that had really upset Natalie because the girl was her friend. Now it would sting even more because that same girl had slept with both of Natalie's exes. I made a point to collect items that Natalie would easily identify, like a sweater from the women's track team with a teammate's name on it. Over time, I accumulated a mountain of stuff. A couple of months later, one of Natalie's teammates' boyfriends discovered my involvement with his girlfriend, sparking a dramatic chain reaction among her and her teammates. This led to a massive exposure of each other's indiscretions. The drama was so intense that even their coaches had to get involved. I felt an exhilarating sense of power. In the midst of the chaos, I was consumed by the destruction I was causing, finding a twisted satisfaction in it all. To top it off, that same week, the athletics PR team had plastered massive posters of me all over campus to promote the upcoming game. They were everywhere, some covering entire building facades. So while the drama was unfolding, Natalie and her friends had to see my face all over campus every day. It felt like being a triumphant dictator, both glorious and pathetic at once. Their coach even went so far as to have a serious meeting with the compliance department and my team's coaches. My coaches, however, just laughed it off, saying, "This seems like an internal issue. OP hasn't broken any laws or school policies, so there's nothing we can do." This response only fueled the women's track coach's anger. Their team was unraveling, their national ranking was tanking, and Jessica's coach even got into trouble for tearing down some of my posters in a fit of rage. I reveled in all of it. I kept stoking the flames by posting photos of myself with various girls, always smiling and looking happy on Facebook and Instagram. But underneath it all, I was bitter. I was so entrenched in my new vengeful mindset that I'd completely forgotten the kind-hearted, naive person I used to be. I loathed my old self for letting a girl humiliate me. Reflecting on it, now it's pretty depressing. No one could tell, though, because I maintained a cool guy facade around everyone. There was even a girl on campus from another sports team who claimed she was pregnant with my child. After I pretended to be interested in her, just like I did with the other girls on Jessica's team, I moved on as soon as we passionately embraced. It turned out she wasn't pregnant, but the gossip and press surrounding the claim only served to drive the knife deeper into Natalie's side. I left behind a trail of deceived women and shattered relationships. I feel remorseful now, but at the time I didn't care because I saw them as equally at fault for cheating on their boyfriends or sleeping with their friends' exes. It didn't take long before girls started becoming wary of me. Plus, I was running out of viable targets. Man, I was really a terrible person with the way I was thinking. I started pursuing girls who weren't even friends of Jessica or on the track team, just people who happened to be around her in everyday life. I even tried to flirt with her sister, who was married with a kid. I almost succeeded. She was interested, but Jessica's dad found out and stepped in before anything could happen. Her sister ended up being ostracized when the news spread within the family. I wanted Jessica to see that I was everywhere, a constant reminder of how she'd messed up. In my mind, all of this was her fault, and she had unleashed this whirlwind of chaos upon herself. She shouldn't have messed with me. The whole situation led Jessica to take an extended medical leave due to the severe depression and mental health issues she was grappling with. She was becoming suicidal, went on medication, and lost a significant amount of weight, looking extremely unhealthy. Watching her suffer made me feel better. By this point, I had already caused more damage to her than she had done to me, but I had become addicted to the feeling of power. I didn't spend any time processing my own emotions or trying to move on. All I craved was more revenge, and I couldn't stop. After weeks of ignoring Jessica's texts and calls, she finally managed to reach me by showing up at my apartment unannounced late one night. She came to collect some belongings she had left behind from when she lived there. Since she was local and her parents lived nearby, she was now staying with them while on medical leave. I told her I'd bring her things to her parents' house that weekend, but said I couldn't let her in because I had company, which was true, but unfortunately not one of her teammates or friends. I decided to bundle up all the items I had collected from various girls, Over the weeks, about 8 or 9 things, including a mix from Jessica's teammates and others. I stuffed everything into large black trash bags along with Jessica's belongings and took them to her house. After leaving the bags on her porch, I called Jessica's dad to let him know we had always gotten along well, and he even supported me after Jessica and I broke up. However, after these events, his opinion of me had clearly soured. 15 minutes later, Jessica called. I answered, eager to hear her reaction to the mixed-up collection of belongings. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the kind of desperate, incoherent crying that comes with hysteria. Her tears were not filled with anger, but rather with a desperate plea for me to stop my cruelty. I savored the moment, feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction at her distress. I responded with a smug remark. Why were there other guys in our relationship? You mixed them into our relationship, just like I mixed other girls' things with yours. It's a perfect metaphor. I thought it sounded profound at the time and was pretty proud of my cleverness. Facepalm. Later, I discovered from one of Jessica's friends, who had known about her cheating, that Jessica had convinced herself I was the one being unfaithful. Her reasoning was that I was always out of town, despite the fact that my travel was due to basketball, a legitimate reason that was even publicly available on the school's website. I stayed in constant contact with her during my travels, though I couldn't always be on my phone during practices or meetings. It seemed like a flimsy excuse she used to shield her own insecurities or maintain a facade in front of those who knew about her infidelity. Months go by. Jessica returns to school from her medical leave, and we cross paths at the physical therapy center in our athlete facility. Seeing this as another opportunity for revenge, I decide to play along and pretend that I want to rekindle things with her. She's hesitant at first, but after about a week of my persistent efforts, she eventually agrees. We begin to rebuild our relationship, though it's more like an elaborate facade. For about a month, I impose strict conditions. Jessica isn't allowed to have male friends or go out with her girlfriends, and I demand full access to all her accounts and her location at all times. It's less of a relationship and more of a hostage situation, but it gives me a warped sense of control. Throughout this time, I'm far from faithful. My plan all along was to deceive her into thinking we were working things out while I continued to cheat. Eventually, she discovers that I've been sleeping with someone from her class. This leads to a dramatic and nasty breakup, where I revel in the fact that she's now experiencing the same betrayal I felt before. Once again, I feel triumphant, satisfied in causing her pain. After this, we don't speak for years. I graduate from university and move to Central America. About a year after relocating, and 2 years since our last interaction, Jessica reaches out to me. By this point, my life has spiraled into a series of drug-fueled escapades and illegal activities. I've become a shell of my former self, consumed by a life of vice and criminality. Yet despite my own moral decay, I still blame Jessica for the person I've become, refusing to take responsibility for my actions in bitterness. When Jessica's message comes through, I see it as another opportunity to hurt her. Even after all these years, I'm still driven by the need for revenge, unable to move past the anger and pain she once caused me. We start chatting again, and our conversations soon become flirty over Facebook Messenger. Despite the ocean and several countries separating us, the spark from our past seems to reignite. I mention that I'm planning a trip back to my old university to visit friends, but embellish the truth, telling her instead that I'm moving back to the city for a new job. We agree to meet up and explore if there's anything left worth saving between us. I put on my best acting hat, feigning that I've moved past our tumultuous history. In reality, I'm just as vengeful as ever Jessica is in her final year at university, and I make the trip back to the USA with a carefully orchestrated plan. We meet at a coffee shop, and the evening stretches into the night. To her, it seems like we've both grown, and that there might be a chance for us to work things out. However, my trip is a lie. I'm only staying for 2 nights, and she remains unaware of my true intentions. We spend those days together, reconnecting and hooking up. I make sure to keep the facade up until the end. As I pack my things and prepare to fly back to Central America, I block her on all social media and communication platforms. I leave her behind, fantasizing about the confusion and hurt she might experience when she realizes I won't be returning as planned. This time, however, the satisfaction from my act of revenge is less fulfilling than before. The thrill of causing pain has lost its edge, leaving me with a hollow feeling as I board the plane. My drug habit and reckless lifestyle spiraled out of control over the years. 3 years after my initial downward spiral, I ended up in the hospital, my life hanging by a thread due to my extensive substance abuse. I was never sober for a full 24 hours since the day I first saw that devastating period calendar, looking back. As much pain as I inflicted on Jessica through my vengeful actions, the reality is that my new identity, one shaped by anger and bitterness, became a darker reflection of who I used to be. I devoted so much energy to exacting revenge for her betrayal, but I now see that I should have channeled that same energy into healing myself. If you're experiencing the aftermath of infidelity, seeking revenge might provide a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but it won't mend your broken heart. Instead, invest your time and effort into your own recovery. Revenge is a distraction that often keeps you from addressing the deeper wounds and rebuilding your life. Thankfully, I managed to get sober and have maintained my sobriety for over 4 years now. Even when another relationship ended with betrayal before I achieved sobriety, I refrained from retaliating. Instead, I chose to focus on my own healing and personal growth. This approach was far more rewarding than any revenge could have been. Today, I'm happily married to a wonderful woman who shares my commitment to sobriety, and my life includes a dream job and a fulfilling relationship. In writing this, my goal is to convey how deeply satisfying, yet dangerously addictive, the act of revenge can be. Revenge, while often perceived as a way to reclaim power and dignity, can ironically lead to a profound loss of self. The gratification I initially felt from exacting revenge was intoxicating. It was as though each act of retaliation provided a temporary high, overshadowing the growing moral decay within me. This dark journey transformed me from someone who was once compassionate and forgiving into a person consumed by bitterness and anger. The pursuit of vengeance overshadowed my own well-being, steering me down a path of destructive behavior that was more harmful to myself than to anyone else. As I reflect on this, I recognize how these actions and the resulting self-destructive lifestyle became a toxic spiral. My focus on harming Jessica and others as a form of revenge only deepened my own suffering. This obsession with revenge gradually eroded my morals, making me lose sight of who I once was. I wish I had channeled my energy into healing rather than perpetuating a cycle of harm. Revenge, though momentarily satisfying, did nothing to address my underlying pain or rebuild my shattered sense of self. Now, years later, having moved past the chaos and found stability, I see the broader impact of my actions. It wasn't just about hurting Jessica or proving a point. It was about the personal cost of letting anger dictate my actions. I hope sharing this story provides insight into the dangers of letting revenge consume you and highlights the importance of self-healing and personal growth. If you're going through a similar struggle, remember that while revenge might feel rewarding in the short term, it often leaves a trail of self-destruction that's far more damaging than any perceived satisfaction. I look forward to reading responses and reflections from anyone who has faced similar struggles or who finds themselves on a path of vengeance. Your experiences and insights could offer valuable perspectives and support for those navigating their own journeys through betrayal and recovery. Hey everyone, it's been a little over 100 days since I posted this, and I'm genuinely amazed at how many people have read it. I appreciate all the feedback, even though it's been a real mixed bag of responses. It's interesting to see how the sentiment varies across platforms like Facebook and YouTube. One of the most common questions I'm getting is, have you apologized or talked to Jessica since the events in this story? The answer is no, not yet. However, I am planning to. She's on a long list of people I need to make amends with, and I expect to be back in her city sometime next year. I'll reach out to her, then I understand that many of you are advising against it, but I've consulted with my sponsor, my therapist, and my mentors about this. The consensus is that an apology is necessary, and I agree. There have also been a lot of comments where people seem to miss the point of the story and feel compelled to offer unsolicited advice on what I should have done almost a decade ago. While I understand the reactions, the purpose of this post was to reflect on my past actions and the impact they had without bias. It's not about debating what I should have done differently, but about examining the personal journey I went through and the lessons learned from it. As I mentioned in my original post, I've been dating again since the time with Jessica. Most of my relationships after her were positive and healthy. However, I did experience another relationship where I was cheated on in a way that was even more traumatic than what happened with Jessica. This time, I chose not to seek revenge. Instead, I walked away and focused on my own healing. This decision was a turning point for me and ultimately led to my sobriety and the fulfilling life I have now. The response to my post has been overwhelming and honestly heartwarming. I've been touched by the number of men who reached out to share their own stories of infidelity and drug abuse. Many have sought advice or simply wanted to share their experiences and emotions. It's been profoundly fulfilling to connect with others who have faced similar struggles and to help them navigate their trauma in healthier ways than I did back then. I'm considering writing a post about this more recent experience to illustrate how I managed to handle it in a more constructive manner despite being hurt even more deeply than I was with Jessica. The journey from vengeance to healing has been transformative, and I hope sharing this next chapter might offer additional insights and support to those who are dealing with their own challenges. Continuation of story. After experiencing a terrible incident of infidelity with my college girlfriend Samantha, I embarked on a long and exhausting mission to get even with her. This led to years of bitterness and jaded feelings towards women. After college, I headed down to Central America, where I spent years indulging in and selling drugs. I never considered entering a relationship or allowing myself to be vulnerable with another woman. I fully admit that I was a degenerate during this period. After a few years of this lifestyle, I found myself more depressed than ever. The drugs had lost their effect, and I grew tired of the superficial and fleeting relationships I had with women. I decided to abandon everything I was doing in Central America and return to the United States. I called up an old friend and arranged to stay at his place temporarily until I got back on my feet. When I moved back to the USA, I decided to quit the nasty drug habit I had developed following my breakup with Samantha. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to give happiness another shot. I also decided to give dating another try. I began to feel pathetic for giving up on finding someone special, just because a girl in college had broken my heart by cheating on me. A couple of months after moving into my friend's place, I had gone on a few promising dates with local women and started warming up to the idea of letting myself get close to someone again. One day, I met a girl on a dating app. Let's call her Natalie. Natalie was 25 and I was 23. I fell head over heels for her. She had this unique burgundy red hair, not quite orange but more like a fluorescent natural red. Natalie had a 3-year-old son who honestly looked a lot like me, and I loved him from the start. She had just escaped a terribly abusive marriage and was in a situation very similar to mine. She had also gone through a rough period of grief and struggled with a bad drug habit. Having recently cleaned herself up, she was ready to give dating another shot. This was perfect for both of us, because we completely understood each other's emotional states. We allowed each other to proceed slowly without expecting too much. We both had fears of commitment and trust issues, and we were still a bit emotionally fragile due to our past relationships and drug habits. Despite this, we had so much in common. Natalie even said she felt like she was dating the male version of herself, and she liked it because we let each other be completely authentic. As the months passed, Natalie and I grew closer. Her son and I bonded deeply. He even started calling me Dad. He was too young to remember his biological father, and I became the only father figure he knew. The day I taught him how to pee standing up on a tree was a turning point for me, solidifying my role as his dad. From then on, I landed a job at a finance firm while Natalie worked at a nightclub. Things were looking up. We moved into an apartment together, bought a car together, and were in the process of buying a house. We planned to get married and have a child of our own. We only smoked weed occasionally and felt like we had fully recovered from our past drug addictions and emotional turmoil. We had both crawled out of real darkness and found some peace and happiness together. Or so I thought. Natalie and I never had any jealousy or suspicions. We trusted each other completely. We didn't snoop through each other's phones, and we knew each other's passwords and login information, so trust issues never surfaced between us. Typically, I would get up early in the morning to walk Natalie from the parking lot to our apartment. She wouldn't get home from work until after 3 or 4 a.m., and the walk was a bit sketchy. The club where she worked was usually open until 2 a.m., but recently it had started staying open until 4 a.m. most nights or so. Natalie told me, one morning she said she was leaving work a little later because she had to drop a friend off at her house. She told me this only about 5 minutes before she would normally get home. It usually took her about 35 minutes to get back, so I found it odd that she mentioned it so last minute. I knew where her friend lived, and it would only add about 5 minutes to her trip. Natalie ended up getting home about an hour later than usual, and something felt off. She looked high on weed, but like she was on coke or Molly. I briefly confronted her, but she brushed it off, saying her friend's car had broken down, and they tried to fix it, but couldn't, which was why she was so late. This was the first time in nearly a year that anything like this had happened, so I quickly suppressed my suspicions, chalking it up to my paranoia from past infidelity and dishonesty. I told myself that Natalie would never do anything shady. She had gone through the same thing I had and knew all the details of my last relationship. She would never do that to me, especially since she had experienced it herself. I wasn't even that suspicious of her cheating. I was more worried that she was doing hard drugs again. Slowly but surely, incidents like this began to happen more frequently. It started with once a month and eventually escalated to almost every week. There were several nights when I was nearly certain she was high on drugs, and we fought about it. One day during one of our arguments, she finally admitted that she had done half a line of coke once because she was tired and needed to pick me up to get through work, but she insisted that was all she had done. By this point, Natalie was coming home at 5, 6, or even 7 a.m. regularly. Her club closed at 2 or 4 a.m., depending on the day of the week. She always had excuses. Her car wouldn't start. She went to a friend's house after work to smoke weed, or she went to a Waffle House with some of her co-workers after their shifts. Then one morning, her text messages seemed severely suspicious. She wasn't responding promptly, and it really felt like she was forcing herself to sound genuine when texting me. She was doing the "I'm going to be home a little late" dance again, but this time it really dragged on. She told me she was on her way at 6 a.m., 2 hours after the club closed. So at 6:30, I went outside to the parking lot to walk her in when she arrived. It was snowing heavily outside. A blizzard was sweeping through the area. About an hour went by with no word from Natalie. I texted and called her repeatedly, but she didn't answer. Finally, I got a message saying she was almost home. Another hour passed before she finally pulled into the parking lot. It was 9:30 a.m. I had to call out from work because I couldn't leave her son home alone. I usually left for work at 7:30. Standing there completely covered in snow, I walked up to the car and opened her door. Natalie looked at me like she had seen a ghost. She started rambling nervously and almost incoherently, saying she got pulled over but was let off without a ticket. She said the car ran out of gas, so she had to stop and fill up. She claimed her friend was having a mental breakdown, so she stayed to help her after work. She even began blaming me for things like saying she wouldn't have gotten pulled over if I had taken care of the car registrations sooner. Yada yada yada. The thing is, she could have told me all this by texting or calling me at any point during the ordeal. It was all very suspicious. The whole time we walked into the apartment, Natalie wouldn't shut up spinning wildly inconsistent stories. I couldn't help but notice her dilated pupils and how she was visibly grinding her teeth. By this point, I was furious, but I was also exhausted and freezing from standing outside for hours, worried sick about her. I decided to temporarily let it go and tried to distract myself with some video games. I was convinced she was doing cocaine at her after work. But what else was she up to? Who was she doing coke with? Just her coworkers and friends? Was she using other drugs? Was she cheating? I was only mildly worried about her cheating. My main concern was her drug use. We both had our past run-ins with drugs, which is why we now only smoked weed occasionally and had a drink every now and then. We were not sober like people in a 12-step program, but we tried to keep things mellow. Her lying about the drugs was even more concerning to me than the actual drug use, because it triggered my trauma from Samantha, who lied to me and cheated on me in college. I was at the point where I didn't even care if she was doing drugs. I just wanted her to be honest with me. The thought of being in another relationship where my girlfriend was lying to me about anything was unbearable. My mind began to spiral, and I felt completely betrayed. Natalie and I had helped build each other back up after our tumultuous pasts, and now we had wonderful lives together. I never thought she would lie to me about anything. We had always had an open-book, trustworthy relationship without any problems like this, before I became obsessed with finding out if she was lying about the drugs. I needed undeniable proof. The next day when she left for work, I tore up the house looking for something. I didn't even know what I was searching for. A bag of coke. Some pills, maybe. I went through every drawer, every nook and cranny of every piece of furniture, coat pockets, on top of the cabinets, anywhere she could hide something. I found nothing. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. My PTSD and insecurities from my past relationship were triggering me, and I was getting obsessive about trying to find something that wasn't there. I decided I would stop trying to uncover whether she was lying, because if I was wrong, my behavior could ruin a good relationship. I thought Natalie would never lie to me, or even worse, cheat on me. She had a horrible experience with her ex-husband cheating on her while she was pregnant, and he also hid a drug problem from her. So I couldn't imagine her doing the same thing to me that her ex-husband did to her. So I let things go. For a while, Natalie started coming home at normal times again, which calmed me down a lot. I began to feel bad for my paranoia. Until one night, I was at a local pool hall playing a game with a random guy. Let's call him Derek. As we chatted, I mentioned that my girlfriend worked at the clubs, named Derek's sister Megan was hanging out with us while we played pool, and said she worked at the same club a couple of months ago. I asked if she knew Natalie, and she said she did, but they weren't really that close. They mostly knew each other. In passing, I then expressed my wish that Natalie had a day job so we could be home together more at night. I mentioned that since the club typically closed at 4, I only saw Natalie for about an hour or two before I left for work in the morning. Megan looked at me confused and said I thought they closed at 2 a.m. When I worked there, we only stayed open until 4 on Friday and Saturday nights. I told Megan, they changed the hours after you left. Megan then mentioned that her roommate still worked there and had never mentioned the closing times changing, as she still came home just after 2 a.m. during the week. It got awkward fast, but I shrugged it off and finished the game of pool. After the game, I went home and I couldn't get what Megan told me out of my head. I looked up the club Natalie worked at, and indeed it said they were only open until 4 a.m. on Friday and Saturday nights, and 2 a.m. every other night. I convinced myself that maybe they hadn't updated the times on their website yet, after making changes or something. Deep down, though, I knew Natalie was up to something. But I was so scared of being lied to again after years of avoiding relationships for that exact reason, I was in full-fledged denial.